The FiringChamber by John Metcalfe. The Reverend Noah Scallard had been long esteemed by his parishioners. Behind his works of kindness, which were many, they recognized the power of a lively faith. And if, to some, he seemed a man with thoughts almost too heaven-fixed, almost too naively and eccentrically spiritual, that could be called, perhaps, a good fault in a parson. Normally his face held a remote placidity, but today it was drawn and pain-lined. "Dreadful," his mind repeated. "Dreadful, dreadful." He went into his study and read again the account in the morning paper. Not that he need. He had been there, at the spot, yesterday himself, and spent most of the afternoon and evening in trying to comfort the bereaved. Dreadful, yes, dreadful. It had been one of those shocking, frightful things that sicken the imagination, and it had happened here, at the old double-dyker potteries, barely a half-mile from his vicarage. A poor fellow in the night shift, about to come off duty, had gone into the FiringChamber, presumably to cast a last glance over the stacks of recently glazed china. The switch of the electric current, which would presently raise the temperature of that 14 by 8 foot space to several hundreds of degrees, had been thrown in, and the twin automatic doors had slid to after him. His shouts and frantic batterings had been unheard, and it was not until some 20 minutes had passed that his mates missed him. Then, as the ghastly possibility occurred to them, they had run to the chamber and opened its doors. The smoking, cindery object that fell out on them bore no resemblance to Bert Winsham. "Oh, Lord, how could you?" The reproach was implicit, but would have been no sharper or more poignantly bewildered if spoken in so many words. To Scallard, a humane and gentle being, the affront to reason as to morality seemed monstrous. How had the eternal goodness, infinitely compassionate, countenanced this outrage, this enormity that had no sense or justice? People are dying in torment somewhere, every instant. Yes, he knew all that. Somewhere, but this was here. This had to be different. The horror was laid at his doorstep. He had been friendly with the man, and was acquainted with his mother and stepfather, and with his girl. It was as if he, Scallard, had himself shared that last anguish. Over and over he pictured it. The hideous leap of terror as the doors slid to. The few seconds of stunned incredulity. "But it can't happen to me. It can't. The delirium of panic and the yellings, poundings with bleeding knuckles. Gradual discomfort, realized with who could say what mental agony as but the merest prelude to the hell to follow. The singeing, smoking clothes, starting out here and there into a racing tracery of sparks. The bursting ecstasy, so long as thought remained, of an intolerable self-pity. The world should know. It never will. Then, finally, the peeling, charring flesh. The dying screams, the scrabbling of a grotesque, blind, no longer human thing against now almost red-hot steel. Ooh. There was, suddenly, a knocking. "Noddy? Noddy, let me in." The vicar rose slowly from his knees and unlocked his study door. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to shut you out." He stood penitent, confronting his wife. "I know, dear. I don't mind, but I could hear you." She pondered him, affectionately enough, and yet with a detached, pensive air of competent, considering practicality, and laid a cool hand on his head. The two had been married 15 years, and, after the first 3 of them, the realization that unfaltering love could still persist and coexist with an admitted incompatibility, had come to him as something of a shock. Esme had been the daughter of a psychiatrist, and had acquired his outlook, whereas her husband's nature was, in the main, instinctive. Hers had been combatively clinical and analytic. She had everybody typed. He could recall, with unimpaired dismay, how he himself had been summarily classified as an unmentionable adjective commencing with a vowel, sadist. And yet their partnership had worked, and they had worn together better, maybe, than most couples. His visions and her brass tacks of psychology had somehow balanced rather than opposed each other. "You're worrying about Wincham, I suppose," she said now, resignedly. "I wish you needn't." She was taller than he, her dark hair overtopping his silvering locks by quite a head, a shade big-boned and rangy, but with a sort of gauche distinction. Her tone, as she looked down at him in shrewd concern, had carried a composedly protective and, as it were, too understanding reproof. "How can I help it? How—" He made an erratic gesture. "It gets you nowhere. It can't alter anything. What happened has happened, and was, as you'd say, the Lord's doing. Why his doing, I certainly wouldn't know. But he does go on doing things like this, and apparently there's no stopping him. Leave it alone, and don't gloat. Oh yes, it is that, actually, an inverted form of gloating." He shook his head in violent impatience and denial, but did not answer. Presently, with a slight sigh, she kissed him brusquely, and then left him. And more, as the day wore to evening, nightfall, and another dawn, the thing besieged him. He had gone round again to Wincham's mother and stepfather, to his fiancée and his brother, and been, incidentally, astonished at their seeming incapacity of realization. None of them had the remotest apprehension of the fatality's true horror. They were grief-stricken, yes, and genuinely, yet it was only he, Scallard, who was able to form the least conception of the Gethsemane, the sheer extremity of torture that poor wretch had suffered, who could relive, re-die his terrible last moments. He had even the impression somehow that Wincham's relatives were doing all they could not to imagine, not to see or feel, and were resentful of his keener sensibilities. "It's like this, parson," the stepfather, a large flat-headed man with sparse-oiled hair, a soiled white satin ceremonial neckerchief in lieu of black, cracked fingernails and flesh moles, had remarked. "It's like this. What our Bert went through must have been bad, and more'n bad, but gassing and creating won't do him no good, nor us. Nor get us back his week's pay packet, neither. It's a bad go, anyways you look at it. and all as we can do is try and keep our blooming spirits up." To the vicar's saddened scandal, he had proceeded liberally to spike his mug of tea with gin. Next day, Sunday, Scallard spoke in his morning sermon of the burning, fiery furnace. It was not really a very apposite or happy text, since, as he himself half perceived, only the most superficial parallel was to be drawn between the Bible story and the tragedy at Double Dyker. But it struck him at first as topical, and allowed him to expatiate upon the torments of incineration. The Trojets, Winsham's mother and stepfather, were not in church, and he had given the freer rein to his imagination. However, certain of the congregation had stirred restively, and the works manager, passing him in the lane after the service, had awarded him an actual scowl. There had been vague talk of an inquest, but the facts seemed plain enough, and the funeral had been set provisionally for Tuesday. Somebody at the Home Office had been on the phone to Double Dyker, and the area factory inspector was petulantly preparing a report. There had been comings and goings. Wreaths were arriving, and the vicar, within his competence in the affair, had had his hands full. What had all this to do with it, he thought angrily. The core of the whole ghastly business, the only thing that mattered, and besides which these uncomprehending fussings, lamentations, and inquiries were but the veriest irrelevant impertinences, was the ineffable extremity of anguish endured by a single human soul sometime between 6:20 and 6:45 a.m. last Friday. It was that which everyone was trying to forget and overlay, and it was that which should be driven home to them and kept alive. Thanks to his friendship with the section foreman, Cardew, who was also one of his sidesmen, Scallard had had rather greater freedom of access to the finishing and glazing shops than, in the normal course, would probably have been permitted to anybody unconnected with the pottery, vicar or no. A Christmas club was being organised by his youth guild, and Cardew was drumming up subscriptions for it in the works. Scallard had often peeped in there to chat briefly with him, and pass a kindly word, maybe, with several others that he knew, including Winsham. 3 of the learners, too, at a long bench in an adjoining alcove, were in his choir. Since that Black Friday morning, Scallard had twice visited the scene of the tragedy, approaching it as if it were some awful shrine. The FiringChamber, purged of all frightful traces, wore, to his feverish fancy, a look of bestial, meek complacence. It was in a sort of semi-basement, neat, gleaming, and spotlessly clean. There was only one other of its capacity somewhere else in the Double Dyker, and any indulgence of sentiment involving its temporary disuse would be expensive. It was, when Scallard saw it, still piled with ware, as usual. Merely a pair of electricians had been fiddling glumly with the switch and testing the operation of the doors. Dreadful, he thought again. Yes, dreadful. Dreadful. Tears smarted under his lids, and he experienced an odd, almost voluptuous tightness in his chest. He moistened his lips and hurriedly wiped his eyes. Dreadful. Yes. Dreadful. All Sunday and all Monday, his sombre conjurings of Winsham's agony went on. I have never been through anything like that, he thought. Anything remotely like it. Even to hold my finger in a match flame for a second makes me wince and turns me sick with pain. And that is just a taste. Only the tiniest taste. How can the martyrs at the stake have stood it? Would any of them have recanted after all, once they were properly alight and frizzling. And if they had been given the chance to get away, I expect so. Well, every man has his price, they say, and every man has his limit of endurance. But Wincham's sufferings weren't undergone deliberately, of course. They were utterly fortuitous and senseless, not even an unconscious expiation, as you might say. He was an ordinary, decent sort of chap, as good as most. Yet he did go through that ghastly tribulation. There's no getting over that. He did. Somehow, the frightful thing, and unsought accident though it had been, which had befallen Wincham, had made him, Scallard, feel inferior. It took on, somehow, and insensibly, the character of an example and a challenge he would be too craven, if it had really been a challenge, to accept. For a while his wife did not again attempt directly to rebuke him. His continued dark engrossment with the Wincham theme was obvious, yet it was now too late, she doubted, to reform such mental habits and amend his ways. She could but watch him, in a gathering exasperation and anxiety. Poor Noddy, she thought. Poor Noddy. She stood at the window as he toddled off, unconscious of her observation, towards the church. He had a rather odd, stiff fashion of walking, with very short, quick steps, and his body as a whole held rigidly upright. Vaguely he made her think of the Minor Prophets, or maybe of Havelock Ellis, if only he, Noddy, had had a beard. Or no, he was more like a ninepin, a passionate ninepin, or one of those little plaster figures of Father Christmas filled with sweets, save again for the beard. Poor Noddy. What could she do with him? He was the slave of an emotional hypertrophy, a voluptuary's whipping up of mere sensation, that resembled a kind of spiritual abuse, and left him bankrupt for life's ordinary pedestrian occasions and necessities. She had feared for him many times, and now this Wincham business was the limit. Already she had caught comments. He was taking it too much to heart. That was how people put it, but she knew what they meant. There was uneasiness and criticism in such remarks. Poor Noddy. He was rounding the bend of the road now, and her glance, for a moment before he disappeared, seemed to embrace and seize in instantaneous summary his every virtue and his every foible. She made a sudden, slight, despairing gesture. Poor Noddy. Tuesday was here. As a concession to local public opinion, Double-Dyker, after all, was closing down from noon, so that those who wished might attend the funeral. The remains, those terrible remains, lay coffined in the church by the Troget's express desire, awaiting burial. Almost till dawn Scallard had travelled, in a waking nightmare. How could you, Lord? His spirit was tortured and bewildered. This thing was alienating him from faith and reason, from his God. A frantic, half-imagined commerce and communion seemed flippantly in progress between himself and the deceased. The time, by Scallard's luminous-dialed watch, was 2:15. Exactly 91 hours and 40 minutes ago the literal bodily distress must have been setting in. How are you now, Wincham? Beginning to feel it, eh? Yes, not so good, sir. Not so comfy, not by any means. Yeah, it's getting worse now, isn't it? Much worse. Oh, yes, much worse. The world should know of it. Not as it will. And so it had gone on, a veritable debauch of the imagination. What was it Stapleton had said? The view he had attributed to his third, men, that physical pain, being the most intense of all sensed qualities, was the most excellent, and that by its infliction they were creating vivid psychic reality, and therefore high excellence. Yes, that was it. A single individual's incandescent agony might well outweigh the slow, summed happiness of aeons. Raise the endurance limit, and you raise the experienceable torture. Pain was the concentration of reality, the realist real. He arrived at the church, weak and shaken. Emerging from the vestry, he could hardly see the packed nave or the piled wreaths on the coffin. He went through the service in a trance. Pain, came his own words later from the pulpit, is the one great reality. The measure in which we willingly submit to it, nay, actually pursue it, is the measure of our nobility, our worth and fitness in the sight of God. We may be spared a direct call to the supremest suffering, but we should not construe that as a dispensation, a permission to indulge and spare ourselves, to let ourselves off too lightly. What God may spare us, let us, for our soul's profit, seek of our free choice, accepting pain's vocation, even if need be contriving, clasping its occasion. Let us, in emulation of those holy martyrs who... The noise of his voice went on, but as if distantly or at some curious remove. It was as though he were listening to someone else and able to catch only snatches, here and there. And then, at the graveside, under the dull October sky, he heard himself again. Shall change our vile body, shall change. Shall change. Oddly, and with another more intent and inward ear, he attended to a rising, secret, desperate supplication, a furtive, almost as if it were a cunning prayer. Lord, give me strength. The mourners were gone. The body was buried. He had tea, replying absently, though composedly enough, to the remarks by which his wife tried to distract his thoughts. Oh, talk away then. Talk away, he brooded. It's your last chance, perhaps. Dusk had fallen when he again left the vicarage, and it was nearly dark when he reached the works. Fortune favoured him, if you could call it favouring, by letting it be Ransom's turn at the main gates. Ransom, it happened, was his cook's brother, and by way of being a protégé of Esme's. "Good evening, Ransom. Want to see my pass?" "Eh? Oh, it's you, sir. Good evening, sir." Scallard did, in fact, have a pass, as for that matter had the local Catholic priest and Methodist minister. These documents, issued at the personnel manager's discretion, were largely of a complimentary nature, but in the overgrown pottery village possessed a practical convenience as well, since there were frequently afoot amongst the men community activities of a welfare or semi-religious character in which the padres took a leading part. Ransom, beyond a grin, paid no heed to Scallard's question, conceiving it as merely rhetorical or half-jocular, and the vicar, with a faint answering smile, proceeded. He realized that in more senses than one, the hardest portion of his enterprise was yet before him. So far it had been easy going, but his success in gaining entrance to the actual shops continued problematical. He had accordingly struck something like a bargain with himself. If, having honestly done all he could to carry out what he designed, he were frustrated, then he would be content and recognise it as the will of Providence. For some minutes he waited, vainly but still patiently, outside one door and another, under cover of the shadows thrown by an arc lamp. The doors, as he expected, were all locked, and the place, as he well knew, was equipped with every modern anti-burglar gadget and alarm. In the low shed nearest him, however, a light shone, and as he also knew, this shed had not its own ablutions room. There was a bare chance that presently whoever was in there would come out through the yard, and possibly not trouble to relock the door while he was gone. A footfall sounded hurriedly within, and Scallard's heart surged up into his throat. Yes, it was even so, and the door had been left a crack ajar. The dim form strode past him, on into the yard, obliviously, and, as it vanished round the corner of the shed, the vicar seized his opportunity and tiptoed in. No one else was here. The deserted benches, save at one spot where the light burned, were shrouded in dust cloths, and Scallard, putting an electric torch to sparing use as he crept swiftly along the passage which communicated with the glazing shop, went straight and surely to his goal. It was all up with him. The die was cast. No shirking, he admonished himself with a sick inward smile. Perhaps weakly he had counted on being balked. The probabilities had been greatly against success, and it was now that very fact, the way a fatal run or series of minute coincidences, trivial as momentous, had piled up, which showed him that he had been taken at his word, and that he must go on. Lord, give me strength. Lord, oh Lord, make me steel. He remembered the trick of the switch, for it had been demonstrated to him. Throwing it in, his fingers did not tremble. Make me as steel. For an instant, as he entered the chamber, the metal doors stuck obstinately, as though tempting him to a reprieve, but he helped them on, imprisoning him with his foot. It can have been scarcely 5 minutes later at the most, would say the man who had gone out into the yard, that he came back. He had reproached himself fleetingly for leaving the door unlocked, yet it had seemed at the time a very minor lapse. He was technically on guard duty, with 2 others, over the whole building, but tramping about had got boring, and he admitted having sat down for a little quiet study of the football pools. He had preferred, bad luck again, the yard ablutions room to one inside, because the shed was stuffy, and he had wanted just a breath of air. Returning, he had immediately settled to his pools once more. So engrossed was he that he did not, probably till some while after they had started, hear the cries. And when he did hear them, he remained incredulous, though naturally scared. They were, at this distance, very faint, but came, yes, from the firing chamber. Hastily cramming away newspaper and coupons in his pocket, he pressed an alarm which, sounding through the building, brought the others running to his help. By the time they joined him, he was struggling with the chamber doors, which somehow had got jammed. There were no cries now, and the 2 newcomers were as incredulous as he at first had been. One of them, all at once, burst into nervous laughter. "Cool, strike me. 'Twouldn't matter if anybody were inside. The mucking current's off. They was rewiring everything and changing the connections. Last thing they did. No juice, see? Not a drop. Well, get the damn things open anyhow. If we... Suddenly, the steel panels eased and fled apart. The three men drew back, stumbling over one another, with sickened screams of terror. Something, a blackened, cindery something, toppled forwards and lunged at them, still smoking, at their feet. When, stepping gingerly, they mustered enough courage to enter the chamber, their horrified bewilderment was not dispelled, for the heating coils were dead, and the air cool. Today's story was The FiringChamber by John Metcalfe. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.